Every Sunday at 5:30, my son rang without fail. 14 years without missing a single week. Last Sunday, the phone stayed silent. I told myself he was busy. A long shift at the garage, maybe. A flat tire on the motorway home. But by 9 o'clock, after 6 unanswered calls, something heavy settled in my chest. Not worry exactly. Something older and quieter than worry. The kind of feeling you get when you've lived long enough to know the difference between a delay and a disappearance. When I drove to his house the next morning and found the curtains drawn and the letterbox overflowing, I heard something that stopped me on the front path. A faint sound from inside. Rhythmic. Deliberate. Like small knuckles tapping against a hollow door. I'm grateful you're here with me right now. Before we go further, drop your city or town in the comments. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from today. And tell me, how old are you? I genuinely want to know who I'm sharing this with. A gentle note before we begin. Parts of this story include fictional elements created for storytelling purposes. But the message underneath is very real, and I hope it stays with you long after the story ends. My name is Tait. I'm 67 years old, a retired carpenter from Tauranga, on the Bay of Plenty. I spent 41 years working with native timber, rimu, and kauri, and totara, learning the grain of things, learning how wood talks to you if you're patient enough to listen. Retirement suited me well enough. I had my workshop, my vegetable garden, my dog Biscuit, a 12-year-old border collie who slept by the fire and pretended not to hear me when I called her for walks. And I had Sundays at 5:30. That was when my son Daniel would ring. Every single week, for 14 years, since the day he moved to Hamilton with his partner Renee and eventually, wonderfully, their daughter Lily. She was 8 years old now, small and sharp-eyed and full of questions about everything. The kind of child who finds magic in ordinary things. She once spent an entire Sunday afternoon with me, trying to understand why wood floats and stone sinks. We never did reach a satisfying conclusion, but she informed me gravely that she'd keep thinking about it. Those Sunday calls were the rhythm of my week. Daniel would tell me about the workshop he managed on the edge of town. I'd tell him about the table I was building, the tomatoes coming in, how Biscuit had stolen half a loaf of bread off the bench and had the nerve to look innocent about it. Then Lily would grab the phone and tell me everything she'd learned at school that week, usually at considerable speed and in no particular order. They weren't just phone calls. They were the sound of my life still being connected to something that mattered. Last Sunday, that sound didn't come. I was in my armchair at 5:20, tea going cold beside me, when I noticed the time. 5:30 came and went. 5:45. I picked up my mobile and dialed Daniel's number. It rang out. I tried again at 6. Voicemail. By 8 o'clock I'd rung 4 times, and each time his voice said the same cheerful thing. "Hey, you've reached Daniel. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." I left 2 messages, kept my voice steady, told him to ring when he got a chance. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. There always is, until there isn't. 41 years as a carpenter teaches you to read the grain of things. Wood will tell you where it's weak, where it wants to split. If you're paying attention, you develop a feel for tension that doesn't belong. And right now, holding my phone in the lamplight of my sitting room, I felt that tension like a line pulled too tight. I thought about Marcus then. Daniel's partner of 9 years. Marcus Webb, financial consultant, good with words and with appearances, always polished at family gatherings, always with the right thing to say. But over the past few months, something about him had shifted. The last time I'd seen him was 6 weeks ago when Lily came to stay for her school holidays. I'd asked Marcus about a trip he'd mentioned to Christchurch. He'd said he was there all week, meetings back to back. But Lily had mentioned offhandedly that Daddy Marcus had been home the whole time, watching rugby and ordering takeaways. I hadn't pushed it. Children mix up days. I'd let it go. Now I wished I hadn't. I rang Daniel once more at 9, straight to voicemail. I sat at the kitchen table while Biscuit pressed her warm weight against my leg and looked up at me with those dark, patient eyes. Outside, the Bay of Plenty was quiet, and the stars were extraordinary. Somewhere 2 hours south, my son wasn't answering his phone. Everything's connected. I used to tell Daniel when he was small, crouching beside me in the workshop while I planed a length of timber. You can't see how a piece of wood is going to behave until you follow the grain all the way back to where it began. He'd nod seriously, the way children do when they're filing something away to think about later. What do you do when you follow the grain and it leads somewhere dark? I set an alarm for 5 in the morning, tried to sleep. The drive to Hamilton in the early gray light took just under 2 hours. I'd made it dozens of times, every birthday, every Christmas, whenever Daniel needed an extra set of hands for something around the house. But this morning the familiar route felt altered somehow, like a road you know by heart that someone has quietly rearranged. I thought about Daniel at 10 years old, following me through a building site in steel-capped boots, 2 sizes too big, insisting he was helping. I thought about the day he told me he wanted to be a mechanic instead of a carpenter. I'd been disappointed for about 20 minutes before I realized that wasn't my call to make. I thought about Lily being born, Daniel ringing me from the hospital, his voice cracked open with a kind of love he hadn't known existed until that moment. The Hamilton suburbs came up around me as the sun cleared the Kaimais. Neat houses, green lawns, the ordinary Monday morning world going about its business. I turned onto Ferguson Street and slowed. Number 16 sat quiet. The curtains on every window were pulled shut. The front lawn hadn't been mown in a while. 3 envelopes jutted from the letterbox. A recycling bin sat at the end of the drive, still out from collection day, which had been Thursday. I pulled over and sat with the engine running for a moment. Marcus's dark blue Hilux wasn't in the driveway. Neither was Daniel's Subaru. I got out and walked up the path. Rang the bell. Knocked twice, hard enough to hurt my knuckles. Stood there on the front step and listened to the silence of a house that had been closed up for days. Then I heard it. From somewhere inside, a small rhythmic tapping, steady and quiet, like someone trying to be heard without making too much noise. My hands didn't shake. I'd like to say they didn't shake. I remembered something from 3 years ago. Daniel had locked himself out on a summer evening, Lily asleep inside, and I'd driven up to help. While we were trying to figure out the back door, he'd laughed and said, he'd shown me then, a spare key hidden under a loose brick at the side of the house near the garden tap. In case of emergencies, he'd said. I'd filed it away and forgotten it until this moment. I went round the side of the house. The loose brick was still there. The key was still underneath it. The front door swung open, and the smell hit me first. Stale air and something faintly chemical, like cleaning product used on a surface that wasn't quite clean enough. I stepped inside and stood still. The living room looked almost normal. Almost. A sofa cushion was on the floor behind the armchair, as though it had been kicked there. The coffee table sat at a slight angle that didn't match the indentations in the carpet. The family photos on the bookshelf were still there, but one of them, a framed shot of Daniel and Lily at the beach, had been turned slightly, as though someone had bumped it and not bothered to straighten it. Daniel. Lily, I called out. My voice sounded wrong in the empty house. I moved through to the kitchen. Spotless in the way a kitchen only gets when someone has scrubbed it deliberately, not the comfortable clean of an ordinary household. The fridge held a 6-pack of beer, leftover takeaway containers, and an expired bottle of orange juice. No Lily-sized food. No apple juice boxes. No yogurt tubes. No little containers of cut fruit the way Daniel always kept them stacked on the second shelf. That was when I heard it again. The tapping, from upstairs, slow and deliberate, like someone conserving effort. I took the stairs faster than a 67-year-old man probably should. The upstairs hallway was dim. 3 closed doors. The tapping came from the one at the end, with the yellow star stuck to it. The one Lily had chosen herself from a sheet of stickers 2 Christmases ago. I pushed the door open. Lily's room was tidy, in the way only untouched rooms are tidy. Nothing moved, nothing lived in, like a photograph of a child's room rather than the room itself. Books on the shelf in her careful order. Drawings pinned to the corkboard above her desk. Her school bag in the corner. And from the wardrobe, the tapping. I crossed the room and opened the wardrobe door. She was curled on the floor behind her hanging school uniforms, small and pale and very still, except for her hand, which had been tapping the inside of the wardrobe door with 2 fingers. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her eyes were glassy with fever and took a moment to focus on me. "Granddad," she whispered. I was on my knees before I knew I'd moved. She weighed almost nothing when I lifted her. Her skin burned through her pajamas. Her breathing was shallow and she'd been crying so recently there were still dried salt tracks on her face. "I've got you," I told her. "I've got you, sweetheart." She put her arms around my neck and held on. I called 111 from the middle of that room with Lily in my lap, her fingers gripping my collar. And I have never in my life spoken more carefully or more quickly at the same time. Waikato Hospital. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me until the ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, which felt like the longest 7 minutes I have ever lived through. In the ambulance, Lily drifted in and out. One of the paramedics, a young woman with steady hands and a calm voice, told me what I already knew. Severe dehydration. Early signs of hypoglycemia. She needs fluids, and she needs them now. When she asked how long the child had been alone, I said, I didn't know, but I was already counting backwards. At the hospital, they took Lily quickly, and I stood in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and tried to make my hands stop shaking. A nurse brought me a cup of tea. I didn't drink. I sat in a plastic chair outside Lily's room and watched through the glass as they put a drip in and checked her over and talked to each other in the quiet, focused way of people who are very good at their jobs. After what might have been an hour, a doctor came out and sat down beside me. "She's responding well," he said. "She'll need to stay overnight, maybe 2 nights. She was very dehydrated and her blood sugar was low, but there's no permanent damage. She's a tough kid." I nodded. I couldn't speak for a moment. When I was allowed in, Lily was awake. The IV line ran into her small arm, and the monitors beeped softly. She looked exhausted, but her eyes were clearer, more focused. She looked at me and managed something close to a smile. "You came," she said. I sat beside her bed and took her hand carefully around the drip line. "Of course I came, sweetheart. I told you I always would." She was quiet for a moment, watching the tube of fluid drip steadily into the line. Then she said, "Dad showed me what to do, in case something happened." My throat tightened. "What did he show you?" Lily's voice was soft and careful, like she was carrying something fragile. "He came into my room one night, maybe 2 months ago. He said if anything ever got really scary, really loud and scary, I should go to my wardrobe and close the door and not open it until I heard his voice or your voice. He said those were the only 2 voices. I felt something go cold and quiet in my chest. Daniel had known. He'd known something was coming, and he'd prepared his daughter the way you'd prepare a child for a storm. He showed me where he hid the tin." Lily continued. "Under the bed, behind the box of winter blankets. There were crackers and muesli bars and a little bottle of water with a lid. He said, 'Eat a little at a time. Make it last.'" She looked down at her hands. "I ran out of water on the 3rd day. At night I could hear that the house was empty, so I crept out to the bathroom and filled my bottle from the tap. Then I went back before it got light. She paused. Dad said being careful isn't the same as being scared. He said being careful is how you take care of yourself. I had to look away for a moment. I looked at the window, at the gray Hamilton sky, at the car park below where ordinary people were walking to and from ordinary lives. My son had spent 2 months quietly, carefully preparing his daughter to survive without him. Why didn't you try to ring someone? I asked gently, when I could trust my voice. Lily's answer was simple and precise in the way her answers often were. Dad said if anything happened, not to use the phone. He said the person who might have heard him might be watching the phone. He said wait for Granddad Gordon. He said you always ring on Sundays, and if you didn't ring, you'd come. She looked at me steadily. I waited for Sunday. You didn't ring. So I knew you'd come. The weight of that. My son's faith in me. Lily's patience and her absolute certainty. I had to press my knuckles to my mouth for a moment to hold myself together. You did everything right, I told her. You did every single thing right. She nodded, and her eyes began to close. The exhaustion was winning. Within a few minutes, she was asleep, one hand still loosely holding mine. I sat there in that dim hospital room while the monitors beeped their reassurance, and I thought about a 38-year-old man who had looked at his life and understood it was in danger, and who had not panicked, not run, but had quietly and methodically done the one thing he could think of to keep his daughter alive. He'd trusted me to come. Detective Sandra Hohepa arrived at the hospital at 2 in the afternoon. She was in her mid-40s, compact and unhurried, with the kind of eyes that took in a room in one pass and filed everything away. She introduced herself and asked if we could speak in the hall. I followed her out. She had a small notebook, and she opened it to a fresh page. When did you last speak to your son? She asked. The Sunday before last. A normal call. He sounded tired, but nothing alarming. I told her about the missed calls, the drive up, the key under the brick. Lily, in the wardrobe. Sandra wrote steadily. And Marcus Webb? When did you last see him? 6 weeks ago. Maybe 7. She looked up. What was your impression of him? I thought carefully before answering. I'm a carpenter. I spend 40 years working out where a piece of timber is going to give way. Marcus always felt to me like a beam with a crack running through it. You couldn't see the crack, but you could feel the way the wood went quiet in the wrong places. She wrote that down without comment. Mr. Tait, she said finally, I think you already know what you're asking me to confirm. I looked through the window at my granddaughter asleep in the hospital bed. Yes, I said. I think Daniel is gone. The next morning, Lily was stronger, sitting up, eating toast with the focused determination of someone making up for lost time. A child psychologist named Dr. Anna Parada arrived with a carry bag full of drawing supplies and the easy manner of someone who did this work with great care. She asked to speak with Lily alone. I watched through the observation window with Detective Hohepa beside me, a small speaker crackling softly on the table between us. Dr. Parada let Lily draw while she talked. Can you tell me about last week? She asked gently. Just what you remember. Lily's hand moved across the paper. She drew 3 figures, a tall one, a smaller one, and a woman she didn't name, but wrote a capital W above. Dad and Marcus were arguing, she said. Marcus brought a woman to the house on Friday night. Late, after my bedtime. I heard them downstairs. What were they arguing about? Lily pressed harder on the paper. Money. Marcus kept saying Dad owed him. Dad said he didn't owe anyone anything. The woman said they'd waited long enough. I gripped the edge of the table. What happened then? It got louder. Dad was telling them to leave. He said he was going to ring Granddad Gordon. Then Lily's voice caught. Then it got very quiet. The worst kind of quiet. Detective Hohepa put her hand briefly on my arm. After the session, she pulled me aside. "The woman Lily mentioned," she said. "Do you know anyone connected to Marcus with the initial W?" I thought. He'd mentioned someone once. A business partner he'd fallen out with. A woman named Diane Wolfe. Allison once told Daniel she made her uncomfortable. That Marcus got strange when her name came up. I told Sandra this. She made a note. "We'll look into it." 3 weeks later, she called me at home. I was in the workshop sanding the legs of a rocking chair I was building for Lily, trying to keep my hands busy and my mind from places it couldn't afford to go. I wiped the sawdust off my hands and answered. "Gordon," she said. "We found him." I sat down on my workbench, a hiking track outside Raglan. An anonymous tip from a tramper who'd noticed disturbed ground off the main path. I won't describe what they found there. Some things don't need to be put into words. I drove to Waikato Hospital to identify my son. Detective Hohepa met me in the car park. She walked me inside without trying to fill the silence with anything. Daniel was 38 years old. He'd had my hands, big and square with wide knuckles, the kind of hands that knew how to make things. I touched his hand in that cold room and said what I needed to say. And then I straightened up and walked out and sat in my truck for a long time with the door closed. The investigation moved fast after that. Detective Hohepa called me into the station the following week and laid out what they'd found on a table between us. Bank statements, emails, phone records, a line of debt that told a story. Marcus had been quietly borrowing against a joint account he'd set up with Daniel's name on it without Daniel's knowledge. The total was $240,000. Loans and defaulted investments and money owed to people who charged interest in non-standard ways. He'd been hiding it for 4 years. 6 months before Daniel disappeared, Daniel had found out. He'd gone to see a solicitor. He'd begun the process of separating their finances and his name from the debt. To Marcus, that meant losing everything. His debts, his lifestyle, and the person whose name had been quietly absorbing the damage. He and Diane Wolfe had been planning it for 2 months. The storage unit rented under a false name. The cleaning supplies purchased in cash from 3 different towns. The text messages sent from Daniel's phone after that Friday night to make it appear he'd left voluntarily. Except Daniel had known something was coming, and he'd hidden a tin of food under his daughter's bed. Marcus's lawyer got him out on bail. I watched the news item from Joyce's kitchen, my hands around a mug of tea I wasn't tasting. There he was on the screen, composed and sad-looking, saying something about a terrible tragedy and how he'd cooperate fully with police. He wore the grief like a well-fitted jacket. Diane Wolfe was arrested 2 days later at a motel in Rotorua. Her sister had called the tip line. I learned this later from Detective Hohepa, who told me Diane's sister had said, simply, "I can't live with what I know. A woman is dead. A child nearly died. I can't pretend that's not what it is." The case came together slowly and then all at once. Gerald Patterson, a man in his 60s who'd lost his retirement savings to a scheme Marcus had recruited him into with promises of guaranteed returns, came forward with documents, commission records, email threads. Marcus hadn't been a victim of the scheme. He'd been part of running it, taking 8% on everyone he brought in, spending it faster than it came. The debt was the residue of a decade of that kind of living. When Diane agreed to a reduced charge in exchange for full testimony, the case became solid. She described the planning in detail. The night in question. The way Marcus had organized everything down to the hour. The way he'd stood in Daniel's kitchen and looked around at a life he'd decided was no longer worth preserving. She also told them that as they were leaving that night, she'd heard a small sound from upstairs. She'd asked Marcus about it. He'd said, "It's nothing. She's probably asleep. Let's go." He'd known Lily might be up there. He'd known and he'd chosen not to check. There are things in this life I will never be able to forgive. That is one of them. The trial was set for the following autumn. 8 months away. 8 months of waiting and preparing and watching Lily slowly rebuild herself in the bedroom I'd painted for her in my Tauranga house, the one with the window that looks out over the garden and the pohutukawa tree she'd immediately decided was good for climbing. Lily started at the local school. Her teacher, Mrs. Ruiha, rang me after the first week to say she was a remarkable child, quiet, but watching everything, taking it all in. She made one friend quickly, a girl named Aroha, whose grandmother lived 2 streets from me. They walked to school together on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The nightmares came in the first month, sharp and frequent. I'd hear her through the wall and be down the hall before I was fully awake. She didn't always want to talk. Sometimes, she just wanted me to sit beside her bed until the dark felt ordinary again. We developed a routine of hot Milo and a few minutes of conversation about nothing important. The weather, what Biscuit had done that day, what we might plant in the garden on the weekend. Slowly, the nightmares came less often. She still kept a small tin under her bed. Not the one Daniel had hidden. A new one I'd helped her decorate with paint and stickers. It had crackers in it and a muesli bar, and a note she'd written herself that said, "I am safe. Granddad Gordon is here." I didn't ask her to take it away. Some things you carry because they've become part of how you feel safe, and there's nothing wrong with that. My own grief was less orderly than hers. I'd go days managing well, getting on with things, and then something small would find the gap. The sound of a phone ringing at 5:30 on a Sunday. The smell of the wood glue Daniel had always borrowed from my workshop and never returned. The way Lily laughed sometimes, sudden and unguarded, exactly the way her father used to laugh. I kept working, finished the rocking chair, started a bookcase for Lily's room, wide shelves for all those books she went through like other children went through food. The workshop kept me from thinking too much, kept my hands in the grain of things, where I understood them. Detective Hohepa updated me regularly. The case was solid. Financial motive, phone records, physical evidence, Diane's testimony, and Lily's account of that Friday night. Marcus's lawyer, a man named Bryce Calloway who wore his suits like armor, tried to have Lily's testimony excluded on the grounds of age and trauma. The judge denied the application. 2 weeks before the trial, Calloway got Marcus onto a current affairs program. Composed and sober-looking, Marcus sat in a neutral room and talked about grief and false accusations and a father-in-law who had never accepted him. He said Daniel had been struggling, that he'd been worried about him for years, that what had happened was a tragedy that no one wanted. I turned the television off and went out to the workshop and sanded a length of timber until my arms ached. The morning the trial began, I drove to Hamilton alone. Lily stayed in Tauranga with our neighbor Mrs. Fenton, who had known Daniel since he was 10 and who baked with Lily and watched old films with her and asked for nothing in return. I'd asked Lily whether she wanted to be there for any part of it. She'd thought about it seriously in the way she thought about serious things. "Not yet," she'd said. "But tell me everything when it's done." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Marcus sat at the defense table looking exactly like a man who had decided to perform innocence and had practiced carefully. His suit was good. His expression was appropriately grave. The prosecutor, a woman named Rachel Aotea, was precise and unhurried. She laid out the motive first, the hidden debt, the joint account used without consent, the moment Daniel engaged a solicitor. She presented it as what it was. A calculation. A man who had treated another person's life as an obstacle to his own survival, and who had decided to remove the obstacle. Calloway argued Chelsea's version, which here was Diane's version, that Marcus had been manipulated by a woman he'd trusted, that he hadn't known what she intended, that he'd been present, but not responsible. He was persuasive in the way that well-prepared liars often are. But the evidence was patient and thorough, and it didn't waver. Gerald Patterson testified about the Ponzi scheme with quiet, methodical anger. He laid out commission structures and email chains, and the names of 11 other people who'd lost money they'd never recovered. He said Marcus Webb was a professional at making people believe he was on their side. A forensic accountant traced every thread of the financial deception. A communications expert presented the phone records, including the texts sent from Daniel's phone in the hours after Friday night. Texts designed to look like a man leaving voluntarily, which broke down quickly under scrutiny because Daniel had never in 14 years texted me with a full stop at the end of every sentence, and the texts that night had full stops at the end of every sentence. That detail undid something in me when I heard it said aloud in court, my son's own punctuation habits as evidence of what had happened to him. Then Lily testified. We'd spoken to her carefully about it. Dr. Parada had prepared her well. On the morning she was scheduled to give evidence, I drove down with her and we stopped at a bakery in Te Awamutu, and she ate a cheese scone with the focused attention of someone who has decided to fuel up for something hard. In the car park, she straightened her jacket and looked at me. Dad always said the truth is the easiest thing to remember, she said. Because you don't have to keep track of it. I had to look away for a moment. That was absolutely something Daniel would have said. In the courtroom, Lily sat in the witness box with her hands in her lap and answered Rachel Aotea's questions in a clear, careful voice. She described the Friday night, the argument downstairs, her father's voice and Marcus's voice and a woman's voice she didn't know. Her father saying he was going to ring Granddad Gordon. What happened next? Rachel asked gently. Lily looked at her steadily. The arguing stopped. There were sounds I didn't understand. Then everything went quiet. Not a good quiet. A wrong kind of quiet. How long were you in the wardrobe? Lily thought. 7 days, she said. I counted by the light under the door. When it was bright, day. When it was dark, night. 7 of each. Several of the jurors were crying. The woman nearest the window had her hand pressed to her mouth. Calloway cross-examined carefully, trying to suggest confusion, misidentification, the unreliability of a child's memory under stress. Lily answered each question without flinching. You were frightened, he said. Aren't you? Frightened children sometimes imagine things. Lily looked at him calmly. I didn't imagine my father's voice, she said. And I didn't imagine 7 days. There was no answer to that didn't make things worse for his client. Calloway sat down. As Lily left the witness box, she paused. She turned and looked directly at Marcus across the courtroom. He met her gaze and then looked away first. Dad taught me to be honest, she said quietly. I'm being honest. Then she walked out with Dr. Parada. Diane Wolf's testimony filled in what the evidence had outlined. The planning, the timeline, the Friday night, the way Marcus had stood in Daniel's house afterward and methodically worked through a list he'd written out in advance. The drive to the Raglan track in the dark, the sound Diane had heard from upstairs, a small sound, and the way Marcus had said, "Leave it, we need to go." She was crying by the end of her testimony. I sat in the gallery and felt nothing for her tears. She'd made choices, and she would live 30 years with the consequences of them. That was not my grief to carry. Marcus testified in his own defense. He was good, composed, credible, calibrated. He described a relationship full of tension that Daniel had created. He described Diane as someone who had escalated a difficult situation beyond anything he'd intended. He looked at the jury with the steady, open expression of a man who has rehearsed sincerity until it looks real. Then Rachel Aotea stood for cross-examination. She walked him through the hidden account, the commissions from the scheme, the solicitor's letter Daniel had received 6 weeks before he disappeared, the storage unit rented under the name M. Thornton, paid in cash. She placed his credit card records on the table between them. 2 days before the Friday night, He had purchased a bulk pack of cleaning cloths, 2 liters of bleach, and a box of heavy-duty rubbish bags from 3 separate shops in 3 separate towns. He explained each one. She listened to each explanation, without expression. Then she asked, "You heard a sound from upstairs. Diane Wolfe has testified that you said, 'Leave it. We need to go.' Is that accurate?" Marcus said, "She's misremembering. I said we should check, and she pulled me toward the door." Rachel let that sit. Then she said, "There was a child in that house, an 8-year-old child, and your concern was getting to the door. That was not," Marcus said carefully, "a choice I made with full information. You knew Daniel's daughter lived in that house. I wasn't thinking clearly. You'd been thinking clearly enough to visit 3 separate shops in 3 separate towns 2 days earlier." Something moved across Marcus's face then, something fast and cold that didn't belong to the grief performance he'd been giving all week. The jury saw it. I saw it. Several of them shifted in their seats. He recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. The closing arguments took most of the final day. Rachel was clear and measured and devastating. She called it what it was: a premeditated act committed for financial gain, followed by a deliberate attempt to leave a child to die because checking on her would have been an inconvenience. Calloway made his final case for reasonable doubt. His client had been misled, manipulated, was present but not the primary actor. Judge Margaret, too, gave her instructions to the jury at 4 in the afternoon. They filed out. I sat with Detective Hohepa in the corridor outside and drank bad coffee from a machine and didn't say much. She'd been on this case for 11 months. She had a daughter in intermediate school. She'd told me once, quietly, that she thought about Lily every morning when her daughter climbed into the car. We waited. At 8:15 that evening, the jury sent word. Everyone returned to the courtroom. The foreman, a man in his 50s with a steady voice, stood and read the verdict. Guilty of murder, guilty of conspiracy, guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice. Diane Wolfe had already entered her plea. 25 years, eligible for review, after 18. Marcus was sentenced the following month. Life imprisonment, with a minimum non-parole period of 17 years. The judge called it a calculated and sustained betrayal of the most fundamental kind. She noted that a child had spent 7 days alone as a direct consequence of his choices, and that this had been a foreseeable outcome he had chosen not to prevent. Marcus said nothing when the sentence was read. He'd run out of performances by then. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with their microphones and their questions. I didn't answer any of them. I walked to where Detective Hohepa was standing by her car, and I shook her hand and thanked her for 11 months of careful, relentless work. She nodded. She looked tired and satisfied in the way people look when something long and hard is finally done. I drove back to Tauranga through the late November evening and walked into my house where Lily was sitting at the kitchen table with Mrs. Fenton, working on a jigsaw puzzle of a New Zealand rainforest. She looked up when I came in. "Is it finished?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "It's finished." She nodded and looked at the puzzle for a moment. Biscuit came and pressed her gray muzzle against my hand. Lily picked up a puzzle piece. "Dad would have wanted it to be fair," she said. "Was it fair?" I pulled out a chair and sat down beside her. "It was," I said. "It was as fair as these things get." She put the piece in. It fit. 6 months on, Lily is 9 years old and in her 2nd year at the local school. She has a best friend named Aroha, a garden plot of her own out back where she is attempting to grow silver beet and strawberries with varying success, and a rocking chair in her room that she sits in to read. She has filled 2 bookshelves and is working on the 3rd. She still sees Dr. Parada once a month. The nightmares come rarely now. She talks about Daniel naturally, the way you talk about someone who has shaped you and will always be part of you. "Granddad," she'll say, "did you know Dad could identify every native tree by its bark?" Or, "Dad said that if you listen carefully enough, wood tells you what it wants to be." I'll sit still when she says things like that and let the words stay in the room. I keep building things. It's the only reliable answer I've found to grief. There's always something that needs making, some shape that wants to come out of a piece of timber. I finished the bookcase. I built a small table for Mrs. Fenton, who has become something between a neighbor and a member of our household. I started a toy chest for Aroha's new baby sister, not because anyone asked, but because I needed something to do with my hands on a quiet Sunday afternoon when the phone wasn't going to ring at 5:30. I miss my son every day. That's not going to change. You don't get over losing a child. You get better at carrying it, is all. You find new reasons to put your boots on in the morning. And for me, those reasons have a name and a garden plot and a habit of asking questions I can't always answer. People ask me sometimes how I found the strength to keep going through all of it. The investigation, the court case, the legal system that moved slower than grief, and sometimes felt designed to wear you down. I tell them it wasn't strength exactly. It was more like grain. Wood has a grain that runs from root to crown, and if you follow it patiently enough, if you refuse to cut across it, it takes you where you need to go. You don't force it. You follow it. Daniel followed the grain when he prepared that tin and hid it under the bed. He followed it when he told his daughter to wait for the sound of two specific voices. He was preparing her not just for 7 days, but for a life he could feel slipping out of reach. And he made sure that life would be anchored to something sturdy. That's what a parent's love is, if you want to know. It isn't only the good Sundays and the easy years. It's also the hard thing you do quietly, the thing no one sees, to make sure the people you love will be held when you can't hold them anymore. There are lessons I take from all of this, and I want to share them plainly because Daniel deserved plainness, and so does Lily. Trust what you feel before you can explain it. I spent months noticing that something about Marcus Webb sat wrong, and I talked myself out of it every time. That instinct wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. If something in a person or a situation feels like a crack in timber that looks sound, keep looking. You owe it to the people who trust you to keep looking. If you are in a relationship where you are afraid, please tell someone. Tell your father, your sister, your oldest friend, your GP, anyone. Allison in the original story, Daniel in mine, had begun the process of getting out. They knew the danger, but they were managing it alone. And managing something like that alone is too heavy a load. There are people in New Zealand who will help you carry it. There are organizations and services whose entire purpose is to help you find a way out before the worst happens. Don't wait until the silence in the house feels wrong. And to anyone who has a child in their life, be the person whose voice they wait for. Not the voice that fixes everything, just the voice they know will come. Daniel taught Lily to wait for two voices, his and mine. That's the whole architecture of safety for a child. The certainty that someone will come. Make sure the children in your life know you'll come. Every Sunday evening now, I sit in my armchair at 5:30 and I feel the absence of the call. I probably always will, but I also hear, from somewhere in the house, the sound of a 9-year-old girl reading aloud to a border collie who cannot possibly be as interested as she pretends to be. I hear the creak of the rocking chair. I hear Biscuit's tail thumping the floor. Everything connects. The root to the crown. The grain all the way through. I'm still following it. If this story has stayed with you, please leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from today. And if someone you know is in a difficult situation at home, share this with them. Sometimes people just need to hear that they're not alone and that there is a way through. Take good care of yourselves and each other. From Silver Stories, good night.